From our world headquarters in New York, it's Bloomberg Surveillance. This hour, we're brought to you by Kundert Volvo and futures just a bit negative, -1 on the S&P futures, Dow futures -7. The former chairman of the Securities Exchange Commission, Bloomberg board member, policy advisor to Goldman Sachs. Right now, that's an important statement. Arthur Levitt, good morning.
Hi, Tom.
Good to have you in here. Get closer to the mic, Chairman Levitt. It's like the 30s or the 40s. You got to get. It's like the RCA shows a million years ago. Ted Kennedy. I don't know how much work you had with the senator. We of course associate him with the Justice Committee and that. Your thoughts on the senator from Massachusetts?
It's a great loss. I think the senator from Massachusetts will be remembered for many, many years. He was keenly mindful of his father being the first chairman of the SEC, and he took a particular interest in the commission and was always in the forefront of protecting the budget of the commission and its direction. I knew him well and respected him highly.
I think of Galvin, the Secretary of State, the phrase I'm going to use for the Commonwealth, up in Massachusetts. I mean, some of that heritage there that Bill Galvin of Massachusetts is the toughest guy in the block. Is that some of the heritage that came out of the 30s and the 40s in Massachusetts?
I don't think so. I think that's a different kind of heritage. It's a heritage of Eliot Spitzer. Every state attorney general in America sees going after securities fraud as their key to the governor's mansion. Mm-hmm. And Galvin is a politician. Will seek every opportunity he can to exploit that. Mm-hmm. I think it has very little to do with Massachusetts tradition.
Huddle. It's a new word in investment in finance. Help me out here. You are a policy advisor to Goldman Sachs, I assume on Washington duties. Have you ever been in a huddle?
No, I have never been in a huddle, nor have I swum in a dark pool. Now, I do have to say...
We're killing ourselves here today.
in terms of fairness, I am an advisor to Goldman Sachs, but I honestly believe that this whole area of research analysis and how it's handled is fraught with all kinds of problems and interpretations. I think you've got to ask, what's the function of research? It's either price target, earnings estimates, quarterly targets, or material information about a company. That's constantly being discussed by the analysts. The misfortune of all of this is that these meetings, which I know are kind of routine in one form or another in other firms, are called huddles. What's a huddle? It's a secret. It's inside. You don't listen to what goes on in a huddle on a football field. But what has been going on in these huddles, in my view, has not been abuse of disclosure. They are trying to give their clients market information, not information about what Apple's earnings may be, but how Apple will fare during the Christmas season or during a market which may be very active or inactive. I think that clearly the questions will be asked about this. If I were at the SEC, I would immediately ask for information from Goldman Sachs. But at the end of the day, I don't think they did anything wrong.
Plus, it's about trade construction as well. Ken.
Our guest is Arthur Levitt, former chairman of the SEC, current Bloomberg board member, advisor to Goldman Sachs. Arthur, Craig Torres in our Washington bureau writes this morning, Ben Bernanke's renomination allows him to redefine the Federal Reserve's mission as he expands its power over financial markets. Do we want to go that way?
Well, you know, it's a Wizard of Oz job in the sense that what he says and how he says it is far more important than some of the details of the rules or the regs coming out of there. I think Bernanke is viewed as kind of a father figure, and I think that the reappointment made a good deal of sense. The Times today has suggested that the Senate should hold Bernanke's feet to the fire because he went along with the Greenspan mode of everything's wonderful, everything's on the table, we have the best of all possible worlds. Yes, that's the job of the Senate. And did Bernanke get everything right? No, I don't know who else would. But right now, America does need a father figure, and he's as good as any I can think of.
Well, you know, he gets some criticism, and so does Greenspan, for not seeing the housing bubble as it was forming. But, I mean, in fact, bubbles are really only apparent in hindsight. Right? I mean, it's very difficult to see one coming.
I think that's true. I also think the criticism is relevant because at various points in time in the economic crisis, he has assured us that the worst is over, when in fact the worst was ahead of us, may still be.
Well, I guess you have to wonder about, you know, Greenspan came very close with that irrational exuberance business back in the 90s. I mean, suppose the Fed chairman were to say, well, things are going to be really bad.
Well, I think it's the job of the Fed chairman to cool things down at such times that he thinks that the bubble really is huge. And while bubbles are unpredictable in advance, clearly after years of a runaway bull market with all kinds of crazy decisions, it's not unreasonable to accept the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board putting a brake on things, saying, cool it, calm it down. It's better than a regulatory fix at that point.
So is what we're seeing here in Washington, is the result going to be more regulation or just the regulation shifting from one agency to another and the level will be about the same?
Tell me what the market's going to do, and I'll tell you how much regulation
Ken
we're
can do that.
going to get. Yeah. But if the market continues to be fairly strong, in my judgment, the amount of regulation that will be enacted will be relatively mild compared to what it might have been 8 or 9 months ago.
Arthur, in a quick minute here before we let you go, where are we as we go to Labor Day and into September in the pricing of toxic assets? Do you feel like we've come a ways here in the last 4 or 5 months, or are we at the same old place we were when the snow was melting?
I think we've come a very slow way. As long as we stay away from mark to the market, what the banks are holding is really almost unknown, and we're not marking to the market. There's too much of it under the table, too much of it yet to come out. No, I don't believe we're in the era of transparency that I think we're going to have to come to before we get out of this.
Well, I thought you were leaving with this good news. You're staying with us. Rich Truman just told me you're still here, so don't move. Let me do a complete data check. Equities, bonds, currencies, and commodities. That's what we do at Surveillance, folks. Let's start with currencies. DXY up just a little bit on U.S. dollar. Dollar yen, 94.12. Make it a stronger yen. That's what we've seen over the last 15 hours. Euro dollar, $1.4298. Euro yen, 134.57. And sterling is weak, down a good 0.5%, 162.67. Oil, $72 a barrel. Gold, $948 per ounce. A 10-year yield, 3.43%.
Some of the news you need from around the world this morning. Senator Ted Kennedy has passed away at the age of 77. He had been diagnosed with a brain tumor in May of last year. NASA has called off the launch of the Space Shuttle Discovery, this time because of a problem with a fuel valve. Earlier this week, the problem was the weather in Florida. Iraqi Shiite leader Abdul Aziz al-Hakim has died in an Iranian hospital. Bloomberg's John Bascom will have more on these stories coming up in a few minutes. In sports, Yankees and Mets both lose, and Mets pitcher Johan Santana out for the season. He needs an elbow operation.
And I heard you say earlier, Ken, Red Sox fans are rooting for the Yankees.
Jerry Azar
I'm confused. I'm way confused. More with Arthur Levitt. It's Bloomberg Surveillance.
Business Flash. Ken and Tom.
Vonnie Quinn, thanks so much. Folks, Bloomberg Surveillance, we're brought to you by Fedi Infinity. And with us, Arthur Levitt, former chairman of the SEC. Arthur, Conrad Hewitt, not a name most people know. And then we go now to James Croker, a name most people know, but this is important. These are the chief accountants of the SEC. How important is that job?
It's a critically important job. It's probably the second most important job at the commission, and Mary Shapiro got an A in terms of the first job, where she appointed Rob Kazami as the enforcement director. But I think that investor groups around the world are probably disappointed that Mary didn't appoint any of a number of chief accountants who were known as being strongly pro-investor.
Within the literature that I see on the web on Mr. Croker, ex-Deloitte too, she's got more of a global view here. Let me suggest that he's more of an institutional choice. Which constituencies would he represent? The Big Four? I mean, it used to be the Big Eight, but then they all merged, right?
Hopefully.
The Big Two.
Hopefully he will consider investors as his principal client. If he doesn't, he will work a grievous harm on the commission. And whatever criticism would be directed at him would be because he came from the firms as opposed to one of the other candidates that came from outside the industry. But it's a great opportunity, a wonderful job, and it's terribly important that he focus on investor protection and clear, open, fair disclosure in terms of mark to the market and other controversial initiatives that he's strong enough to take on the tough issues.
Arthur, a while back there was some really serious discussion about whether London was going to pass New York as being the most important financial center in the world. And we have a story this morning that there are fewer American accents being heard in London. There's a new tax on expatriates, plus the city, the financial services industry in London has been losing jobs. So where are we now in this rivalry?
Well, I think you might throw Paris in there as well, where the French have just put a cap on salaries. We're going to see a lot of this going on in the future, but I think the real recognition of the fact is we are in a globalized electronic market today, and the kind of regulation that you see in one country is going to be picked up internationally. It can't afford not to be. I don't think we're going to see people moving back and forth because of regulatory zeal. That's a threat that rarely pans out as it is. So I think this will constantly be used, but it's a question of convenience, time zones, and other factors, not regulatory arbitrage, that will make the difference.
Let's set up our next hours. Thank you so much for coming in, Arthur Levitt, particularly the conversation on Senator Kennedy and his father and the establishment of the SEC way back, a very different institution.